Today we're going to be talking about the very disappointing, cruelly disappointing aftermath of World War I. Wars are tragic, but strangely enough, in spite of the mass death of World War I, there were hopes that somehow out of the ashes of that conflict, which in the end, almost everyone agreed ended up being meaningless, that a better world could be constructed. And the news of the peace, and what's an odd note, is to be celebrated with great joy. It's not that it's odd that people celebrate peace, but a killer is stalking America at the very moment the war is ending, and that's the pandemic, the influenza that's going to spread across the world that will kill millions, and actually more Americans will die from the influenza outbreak of that year than will die from World War I. Nevertheless, Americans feel a great emotional release when the war ends, and Wilson has proposed a plan. Woodrow Wilson has proposed a plan as President of the United States, January 1918, 11 months before the war is over, for a new and better world. And that speech is called the 14-point speech. He's calling for an end to secret treaties, disarmament. He's urging nations across the world to not stockpile weapons. He wants open trade as a way to tie nations together economically. And he wants a particular body created, an international organization called the League of Nations, which will actually, he hopes, mediate all disputes in the future. He said the war would be a war to end all wars. And in fact, much of the conflict of the 20th century can be tied to the failures at the peace treaty that's hammered out in a place called Versailles in France, in 1919. Now, people are enthusiastic not only in the United States, which we see in this picture, but also in Europe. When he travels there, Woodrow Wilson is greeted like a savior, and millions are going to throng the streets. Every French city he goes to, 2 million in Paris alone. Sadly, as I said last time, Wilson is not going to count on the bitterness of the allies, the wartime allies, the leadership of Britain and France in particular, who see him as naive, as kind of an American bumpkin, in fact, in spite of the fact that he's an intellectual American college professor, and they see him as an impractical man who doesn't understand the hard realities of European power politics. And so he's going to have to deal with this. When he goes to Paris, his chief negotiating partners are going to be these men right here at the Versailles Treaty. We have the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. We have the Italian Prime Minister, Vittorio Orlando. This is the French President, Georges Clemenceau. And there's Woodrow Wilson. And they're going to hammer out, they're going to be the major players, even though every major independent nation on earth outside of Germany and outside of the newly established Soviet Union is going to participate in this treaty. And those four powers are called the four great powers. They're going to be the ones who write it. And really, England and France are going to be the nations that play the biggest role in the treaty that comes out. And the treaty is a disaster. The French and the British believe there's one villain in the war. One power that caused the conflict and all the millions of deaths. And they're going to make Germany pay. They're going to make them pay a very steep price. And the idea is, the theory behind the approach of the British and French leadership is that if Germany is basically rendered powerless, it will never be able to wage war again. And there's something particularly about the Germans that make them warlike. And one way to do that is to, number one, they're going to insist that the Germans basically dismantle their army. That the only use of power in Germany, armed force, would be for police functions. The German army has to vanish, essentially. They're going to demand that the Germans surrender a really important part of their country in terms of industry. This is a part called the Saar. You notice it borders France. This is one of the most industrially productive and mineral-rich parts of Germany. A lot of German wealth is dependent on production there, the resources there. And then on top of that, they're going to insist that Germany pays something that's called, and we've mentioned this before, it comes up in debates about how African Americans descended from slaves should be paid for the suffering caused their families because of slavery. They're going to insist that Germany pay reparations. And the reparation payments are going to be crushing. And it's going to destroy the German economy and create an unstable governmental situation. Germany is having its first experiment in multi-party democracy. The Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany, had abdicated. A republic is created. It is centered in Weimar, Germany. It becomes known as the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic already has a problem with reputation with Germans on the political far right. That is, it's the Weimar Republic that replaced the Kaiser, and they're the ones who surrendered to the Allies. And then when this treaty is agreed to, that is so destructive to the German economy, people who are responsible for the Weimar Republic are basically seen as traitors. And so the Weimar Republic is going to have an issue right away. Under the terms of the Versailles Treaty, Germany is going to owe a $5 billion down payment on its reparations by May 1st, 1921. That is less than 3 years after the war is over. Much of Germany is still laid to waste. The German economy is at a wreck. And by the way, in total, they're going to demand $33 billion in reparations, although most of that will not be paid because one thing Adolf Hitler does when he comes to power as Chancellor of Germany in 1933 is he says, we're not paying the reparations anymore. And that makes him immensely popular. Germans feel betrayed. I think to a certain degree, they're justified. I'm not justifying what Germany does in the 1930s. I will just note that a lot of suffering was created by this. Germans had assumed when they surrendered, and I'm talking about the forces, the leadership in the Weimar Republic, that the peace would be on the terms Wilson outlined in his 14-point speech. And remember, Wilson had said he wanted basically peace without victors. He wanted a war in which no one won, quote unquote, in which we would simply work to not make a war possible again. That's not what happened. Now, one of the terrible things, if we go back to this map, is you see this coastline here? The war is over, but the British want to pressure Germany to sign a treaty that will be very harsh on the Germans, and they sense there might be resistance. And so to maintain that, they keep up their naval blockade. They block important resources coming into Germany after the war is over. And at one point, as a result of the economic damage caused by both the reparation payments, remember this is a time in which you have massive infrastructure damage, mass unemployment, there's a global recession after World War I because nations aren't spending all the money they had before on weapons, paying soldiers, buying food from farmers. All of a sudden that spending stops and it causes the economy to collapse. And Germany most of all. So there's mass unemployment, and with the blockade, at one point 250,000 people in Berlin are unemployed, 250,000 in one city. In 1919, and I want to make sure I say this carefully, because of racism, we are often indifferent in the United States when there's mass death in nations, people by those, what we call people of color, India, Bangladesh, etc. We have giant famines all over the world constantly, Africa, etc. And we grow numb to the numbers the bigger the numbers get. This is 1919 in Europe, which was presumed to be the center of civilization before the war. That's a racist notion, but nevertheless, the white people have that conception. So in 1919 in Germany, 700,000 people, women, children, the unemployed, the old, and returning soldiers starved to death. There's an infamous case in Berlin where a man driven to the edge by starvation commits cannibalism. The Allies insist, by the way, that the reparation payments be redeemable in hard currency. We talked about that when we talked about populist currency backed by gold reserves. So to make up the economic pressure, the German government begins printing mass amounts of paper money for domestic use and for payment of the reparations. They don't have the gold reserves. They're printing paper money. It's just like they're leveling entire force. It's remarkable. The result is going to be something that you may have heard of, inflation. We're going to have in Germany hyperinflation. And the effects of this is going to be devastating. So, for instance, in this period, there's so much money in circulation that the mark, which is the German equivalent of the dollar, the value of the mark drops to almost nothing. The more money you have, the less each individual piece of currency has. Prices on menus at restaurants literally change while you're sitting there eating. There's one price, they don't even, at one point they don't even print prices on the menu because the prices change so frequently. One student was later told, when he sat down on the table for a cup of coffee, that the cup, when he first ordered it, was 5,000 marks for one cup of coffee. By the time he pays his bill, it's 14,000 marks. Workers get paid in giant wads of cash. They immediately, and sometimes they put them in wheelbarrows, the amount of cash they're paid. They wheel it to the nearest store to buy all they could before the money drops in value again. A wheelbarrow full of marks might buy one loaf of bread. An egg costs 100 million marks. At one point, a single US dollar was equal in value to 1 trillion marks. So, what does this lead to? It has very toxic results and long-term and tragic results. 1919, you're going to have a soldier who was an Austrian who came back from service in the German army, who had already been fed a diet of racist ideas and anti-Semitic ideas, hatred of Jews. When he is at the end of the war, this particular man who reached the rank of corporal had actually won a couple of Iron Crosses, which is the German equivalent of the Medal of Honor. He was a courier. He ran messages while bullets were whizzing all around, from one group of German troops to another, conveying orders and information. At the end of the war, he had either exposure to some kind of chemical, chemical gases were used in the war, or it may have been a symptom of what was called in the time hysteria. But in any case, he is temporarily blinded, and he's in a German army hospital, and he hears the news about Germany surrendering. He comes back as a civilian. He had been a miserable, failed artist. If you ever see his drawings, one thing that strikes you, he painted street scenes and there are no people in the street scenes. There might be a bicycle leaning against a wall. The streets are empty, just objects. So he wanted to be an artist, was never accepted into art school. He's a mediocrity. He was really bad at it. So he doesn't have any great employment prospects. So he ends up being a spy for the police. and the police in Germany right after the war, because briefly there's a surge of radical movements in Germany, and including left-wing movements, right-wing movements. There's a brief establishment of a Marxist republic within the boundaries of Germany. It declared, what's called the Spartacus revolt. So the German police want to crush radical movements. They hire this man, Adolf Hitler, to be a spy. And he goes to a meeting of a group called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Now, I want to clarify something. People on the right wing now focus on the name of the party, the fact that the word socialist is in the name of the party, and say, see, it's a left-wing movement. Socialism is the same as Nazism. When the Nazis come to power, they're going to arrest and throw in concentration camps socialists. The Nazi government under Adolf Hitler in the 1930s, when there's a civil war in Spain, when right-wingers are trying to overthrow the socialist government, Hitler sides with the right-wing rebels to overthrow socialists. Communists are going to be thrown in concentration camps. Union leaders, socialists will be thrown in concentration camps, and they'll be made to wear little red triangles. The Nazis were not socialists. They were far right-wing, they were racist, they were nationalists. So Hitler is sent to spy on this party. There are only a handful of people there at this meeting he's sent to. And he's intrigued by their ideas of German racial supremacy. The Germans belong to a race, this party says, the Aryans, who have been the creators of civilization throughout history. He's intrigued. He leaves his job as a spy for the police, and he joins the party. And he quickly becomes the leader of that party. And in 1923, he tries to overthrow the German government. It's called the Beer Hall Putsch. He's sent in prison. He spent some time in prison, and he's basically given a hotel room. There's so many Germans who sympathize with the far right and the racism of the Nazi party that they don't want to really punish Hitler, but they put him in prison, and he spends the time. He's given a secretary. People bring him elegant meals to eat while he's in prison. He gets to write a book while he's in prison. People treat him like a hero. And he writes a book called Mein Kampf that's published in 1925. That means my struggle in German. And it becomes a bestseller. And Hitler has a very simple story to tell. He claims he has an explanation for what happened to the Germans. He said history is defined by the struggle between two races that have kept themselves pure, one evil and one good. The Aryan race, which are the peoples of Germany, who are the creators of civilization, and Jews, who he says are essentially a depraved race that is a parasite race that lives off the accomplishments of others, that worm themselves into other civilizations, undermine them for their own benefit. And that Jews supposedly had manipulated the Allies to declare war on Germany at the beginning of World War I, that Jews supposedly had manipulated world events to guarantee that Germany would lose, that the Jews were the ones who wrote the Versailles Peace Treaty that caused the hunger and the unemployment and the hyperinflation and destroyed German savings, that they are responsible for the thing that the Nazis hate more than anything other than Jews, which is communism. That the Jews were capitalists somehow and they were also communist. None of it makes sense, but that's common in politics. That the Jews were supposedly responsible for the Russian Revolution. And that Russia, the Soviet Union, represents a mortal threat to the Germans. But it was Germany's great destiny to eventually become the leading world power, and that eventually there would be a German Reich that would rule the world. He would later promise a 1,000-year Reich. That the Germans were destined to conquer Poland, Russia and other Eastern European nations, that would be where they would expand their empire, that to survive, the Germans needed living space, which in German is called Lebensraum. All these ideas become very popular, never a majority before Hitler comes to power, but more people supported the ideas than supported Hitler. Hitler would run for chancellor. That's the leadership position in Germany, the actual political leadership. He would be appointed chancellor by the president of Germany. Germany had a system where there's a president who's the head of state but doesn't actually implement policy or write policy, and he would appoint. It's just like England, where you have the Queen officially appoint a prime minister. Adolf Hitler would be appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933. It was largely a result of the resentments in Germany caused by the Treaty of Versailles in 1933. So you could argue that the Versailles Peace Treaty was actually the most important single cause of World War II. World War I directly leads to World War II. What does that mean? Well, World War II will famously end with the United States developing nuclear weapons, bombing the Japanese in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which leads to a world filled with weapons of mass destruction. The two countries that will come out of World War II as the two major powers are going to be a capitalist United States and a communist Soviet Union. The Cold War is a direct result of the failures of the Versailles Peace Treaty. You have also a couple other chapters you may not be aware of. The British and the French used the Versailles Peace Treaty to expand their empires. One of the allies of Germany in World War I was the Ottoman Empire, centered in Turkey. They carve up the Ottoman Empire. The only thing that's left of the Ottoman Empire is modern-day Turkey. Much of the possessions of the Ottoman Empire, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, get turned into separate mandates, as they call them, basically colonies controlled by either the British or the French. Now, there was a man who was a foreign secretary in Britain named Arthur Balfour, British foreign secretary, who was a real serious student of biblical prophecy, as he saw it, believed that one sign of the end of the world and the second coming of Jesus would be the establishment of a homeland for the Jews, the reestablishment of the state of Israel, to get Jewish support in Europe for the British war effort. And I want to point out that a large percentage of the Jewish population in Europe lived in Germany. He wanted Jewish support. He supported what was called the Zionist movement. Arthur Balfour. That's named after a mountain, Mount Zion, in biblical Israel. Zionist movement. The Zionist movement was a movement saying Jews have been persecuted in Europe for centuries, and the only way they could ever be safe was if they had their own homeland. And they considered various places, including, by the way, Uganda and Africa. But the consensus was they should go back to what they saw as their ancestral homeland, ancient Israel. So part of the plans of Balfour, and this gets implemented, is Palestine is going to open up to Jewish immigration. And there are going to be a series of migrations from Europe, of European Jews over the coming decades, called aliyahs. There gets to be a more and more substantial Jewish population in what is called Palestine, that's under British rule at that point. And then 1947, there's a partition after World War II. Jewish land set aside, that becomes the state of Israel. And then the rest of the land is supposed to be, and that mandate is supposed to be under Arab control. The Israelis then have what they call the War of Independence. Arabs call it the Nakba, which is the calamity, the disaster. All the chaotic politics and violent politics of the Middle East can be traced to some of what happened at the Versailles Peace Treaty. One last story about the Versailles Peace Treaty and how it shaped everything that happened afterwards. One man takes Woodrow Wilson seriously when he says that he believes that people living in colonial regimes have the right to determine their own destiny. They have the right to their own independence. You know, Wilson is calling for it, but the British and the French totally reject this idea. It's against their interests. The idea of dismantling these colonial empires. One man goes to Versailles to visit Woodrow Wilson. He's turned down. That man's name is Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is the leader of Vietnamese revolutionaries who were seeking independence from a very brutal French rule in what they call Indochina, which consists of modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Wilson refuses to meet him. Ho Chi Minh will become a communist. He's living in Europe for a time. He's actually, as I recall, a cook in Paris for a while. He goes back to his homeland and he becomes leader of a movement called the Viet Minh. They will win independence from France after World War II. For a time, the Japanese occupy Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh tries to declare Vietnamese independence there. He invites Americans when he reads a speech declaring Vietnamese independence. And he quotes the Declaration of Independence. But the American State Department doesn't believe the Vietnamese are civilized or intelligent enough to manage their own affairs. Plus, they want French support because the United States wants the French to be allies against the Soviet Union in an alliance called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They'll tie the nations of Western Europe in a military alliance against the Soviet Union. They're worried the Soviet Union is going to conquer the world. So we don't back Vietnamese independence. So who does Ho Chi Minh turn to? The Soviet Union. And so that starts the Vietnamese War of Independence from 1946 to 1954 against the French. When the French lose, guess who replaces them? The Americans. And a direct result of what happens in Versailles, what didn't happen, is the Vietnam War. So this is a moment in history that has incredible consequences and a body count in the millions. This is a failed peace treaty. Now, when the treaty is hammered out, the millions of Europeans and Americans who took Wilson's 14 points and his pledge to make the world safe for democracy and to have a war, to end all wars, are going to be bitterly disappointed. Wilson himself is unhappy with much of the treaty. But he consoled himself because there's one idea that survived that was really extremely important to him. That was the creation of the League of Nations. So on July 10th, 1919, Wilson will submit the treaty to the United States Senate. Treaties have to be approved by the Senate. That's part of the separation of powers. And he tells the Senate, he delivers this in person like he did all his speeches, the failure to ratify the treaty would break the heart of the world. But as news of the treaty's provisions, the reparations, the expansion of British and French colonies, which really makes Americans mad. Did our boys die there so Britain and France could become more powerful? When they see what's going on in Germany as a result of the treaty, this treaty becomes more and more unpopular. And, by the way, people are a little paranoid about the League of Nations. They fear that the League of Nations will allow an international body to intervene in American politics. And so Wilson is going to push for this. He's going to be really unwilling to negotiate. And this is a problem. It's the whole treaty or nothing. And, he's not willing to go back and renegotiate it. He says, you accept the treaty as it is. And he doesn't consult during the whole treaty process or when he gets back home with the Republican congressional leaders. And by the way, when there's an election in 1918, in November, the month we win the war, normally presidents who win wars do well in those election years. the Democrats lose power in the Congress. Republicans actually gain control of the Congress, which is fatal to the treaty. And what he said going into the election was this. He said that voting for the Democratic Party was the only patriotic option. You're not a patriot if you vote for Republicans. A lot of voters were offended by that idea, impugning one party and saying only one party was loyal to the United States. So Democrats lose the House, they lose the Senate, it's a whole hostile Congress, and the Republicans say we'll accept the treaty with certain reservations. Wilson's unwilling to take that. And so because of that, they're really angry. They feel like they're being shut out of the process. They're a co-equal branch of government. Well, the other thing, of course, is 1920 is going to happen. This is 1919. 1920 is a presidential election year. It's unclear whether Wilson is going to seek another term in the presidency. And if they hand him a victory on the treaty, certainly without reservations, they're going to give a political boost to someone they want to defeat in November 1920. So Wilson senses that support for the treaty is slipping away, and he says, okay. And by the way, this irritates people in the Congress too, particularly in the Senate. He goes on a speaking tour. He's seeking to go above the heads of the members of the Senate by appealing directly to the voters and saying, we want this treaty. We'll never have another world war again, another great war again, if we ratify this treaty. And he goes on this, and by the way, this is ill-timed for Wilson. He had actually had a history, although this was kept secret, of high blood pressure. And he had actually had a series of strokes since he was a college professor at Princeton. And every now and then he would have a stroke. There'd be temporary paralysis. He would recover. He would learn to adjust. But by the time the League of Nations debate is heating up, you begin to see his memory slipping, his judgment perhaps clouded by brain damage, and it may have reinforced a trait he already had, which was that of stubbornness. So he suffers a massive stroke during this tour across America, making speeches, after making a speech in Salt Lake City. And by the way, his wife, Edith Wilson, had been urging him to stop, to go back home, to take a break, but he rejected that. That stroke leaves him with a paralyzed left arm and leg, and it makes it difficult for him to speak or swallow. And for months, Woodrow Wilson is out of public view, confined to his bedroom, and essentially the only people who see Woodrow Wilson is his wife, Edith, and the doctor. And one person who's kept completely in the dark about what's going on with Wilson, his health, his ability to serve in the office, is the Vice President, Thomas Marshall. The leaders of Congress. Occasionally they set up basically easy visits for him to have short conversations with people in Congress, where they set him up at a table and they prop up his arms so they can't see it's paralyzed, and they keep it to a couple of minutes. They give him prepared remarks that he's memorized, so, to the best he can. So it looks like he's okay. They try to keep him, the fact that he's incapacitated, secret. And there is a long-standing theory that many people have about Wilson in this period. And that is, we have a secret, unelected president. And that president, so here's Wilson, we've seen him before, before his stroke. There's a theory that Wilson is actually being replaced as president secretly by his wife, Edith Wilson. And Edith is deciding, this is known, Edith decides who gets to visit the president and who doesn't. Edith decides which advisors can speak to the president, which can't. Edith decides which matters Wilson is going to deal with, her husband's going to deal with. And occasionally she'll bring back documents for him to sign, and they'll come back signed, but it's not 100% sure who signed them or that Wilson understood what he was signing. In effect, Edith Wilson becomes not just the chief of staff, but Wilson's top advisor, and maybe even his decision maker while he's incapacitated. In effect, she becomes the president. Is that how the Constitution is supposed to work? Who's supposed to serve if the president's incapacitated? The vice president. The vice president is kept completely out of the loop. This is going to have serious consequences for the Versailles Treaty. Wilson's unable to lobby for it during this critical time where the treaty is up for a vote. The United States Senate, in the end, is going to fall 6 votes short of the 2/3 majority necessary for the treaty to be approved, and this will be a serious wound to the League of Nations and its effectiveness. It's going to be, without the United States and the economic power of the United States, the military power of the United States, the influence of the United States, it's going to be a paper tiger as an institution. I mean, it's one thing that's clear about World War I. Great Britain entered that war as the most powerful nation on earth, militarily, economically, whatever. It never gets over it. It will be not the power it was when World War II starts. The United States will essentially have to rescue Great Britain. However determined they are in their struggle against Nazi Germany, economically, England is on a steady decline from that point. It begins to lose its grip on its colonial empire as well, starting that in that period. The United States is the power. And the U.S. not being in the League of Nations means the League of Nations is divided. And when nations begin to violate the charter of the League of Nations in the 1930s, for instance, when Italy, which falls under the control of a fascist government led by Benito Mussolini in 1922. In 1935, without provocation, they have one colony in Africa, Somalia, modern-day Somalia. They invade Ethiopia without provocation. The League of Nations does essentially nothing. When Germany and Italy intervene in the Spanish Civil War between the socialist government and the fascist government led by, the fascist forces led by Francisco Franco, who's backed by Mussolini and Hitler. The League of Nations does nothing effectively to mediate in that conflict, and it's a slaughterhouse. When Hitler begins to violate the Versailles peace treaties by rearming, retaking land that had been demilitarized, sending the army into the Rhineland, which borders France, and that's a territory no German military forces were supposed to enter. He does it. When he basically forcibly annexes part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, with the acquiescence of the British and the French, he basically bullies them into that agreement. The League of Nations is not there to protect Czechoslovakia when Hitler goes ahead and absorbs the rest of the country. Over and over, the League is empty and unable to do anything as Europe slides into World War II in the 1930s. Now, there's so many bad things that happen in this period. The war was horrible enough. But much is going to happen that's terrible economically and politically. And the progressives thought during the war that they were going to get the type of government they always dreamed of, a big government actively involved in the economy, a government that would regulate and eliminate the type of extreme inequality that existed in the robber baron era, that would guarantee that there are decent enough working conditions, that radicalism would be defeated. In other words, decent enough wages that people wouldn't join unions, they wouldn't become communists or socialists. They wanted consumers to be safe with, safe products, all this. That's what they wanted. It seemed like they were getting it during the war year, basically the 19 months the U.S. is in the war. And then all of a sudden that disappears. You have, at the end of the war, with the Republican recapture of the Congress and Wilson's incapacitation, most of the government regulations and most of the wartime agencies that had actually ensured things like higher wages, the right to join a union, etc., began to be dismantled. At the same time, government offices designed to ensure loyalty to the war effort become oppressive. And at times, they basically instigate violent political oppression within the United States. And one of the great ironies is there's never going to be a greater assault on civil liberties, the Bill of Rights, free speech, free assembly, in the United States in the 20th century than this period right after World War I and during the war years, at a time Wilson's saying we're fighting to make the world safe for democracy. Propaganda was a big part of the war effort, and there had been war propaganda before, but never had it been so sophisticated and so extensive. And by the way, new technologies like those silent movies are used as war propaganda. He is worried, Wilson, about the loyalty of the American citizens to the war effort. He realizes there are two big population groups in particular whose loyalty might be in question. The German Americans, and as I mentioned before, Irish Americans. So he feels like you're going to have to pound a pro-war message into the public's mind repeatedly. And so he promotes an indoctrination campaign that's going to be used in the public schools. Wartime propaganda is going to be taught to children. It's going to be in the silent movie houses, little reels. There are going to be rallies. And he gives basically the command of this propaganda effort, running out of space here, to a man who's an advertiser and a journalist. George Creel is his name. He's going to be a progressive journalist who, with money from the Carnegie Endowment, remember Andrew Carnegie, is going to create squads, or what are called 4-minute men. 75,000 volunteers who fan across the country, and they give pep talks for the war effort and distribute press releases advertising every single American military victory and the love that the the people in France have for the American troops and so on. They basically write news stories that are propaganda, that are directly given to newspapers. The newspapers publish these stories as objective news. Casualties are minimized. The use of poison gas is minimized. Other problems, that happen don't receive attention in these stories. They create posters, pamphlets, and cartoons to depict the American cause as noble and depict America as a force that will save mankind itself. Now, this leads to a direct assault on free speech and will lead to people being arrested for expressing the wrong opinions. It becomes frighteningly close to totalitarianism. Wilson will ignore the Bill of Rights and will arrest and harass people who are anti-war. And mobs will actually attack citizens they consider disloyal. Wilson, in effect, endorses this process. He says something very chilling at one point. He says, "One leads us people into war, and they'll forget there was ever such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be brutal and ruthless, and the spirit of ruthless brutality will infect the Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, and that man on the street. We will have mob violence and a wave of persecution of one particular group, German Americans. We will talk about that next time.